Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz Interview Series with Portland-based jazz pianist, organist, drummer, and trumpeter, along with being a teacher and a great band leader, George Colligan. He is one of the most original and compelling jazz cats of his generation, and he spent some time with Neon Jazz talking about his latest 2018 CD called Nation Divided. He's also highly in demand as a sideman, playing with the likes of Cassandra Wilson, Byron, Buster Williams, and so many others. We talked about quite a bit, so please get to know him and dig this interview, my friends.
So, George, thanks for taking a minute out for Neon Jazz, man. I appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure.
So, I guess right now, in this point of American history, in light of the midterm elections, and I don't want to get mired in anything political, but it seems like the name of your album, Nation Divided, is probably just about as apropos for right now in our history than any other time.
I agree.
So let's get into the creative forces and your vision for this album. It's a great album, and I just want to talk to you about this project.
Well, I'm glad you enjoy the album. You know, I've done solo piano recordings before. I did a number of them for Steeplechase, and those were sort of a mixture of standard, I don't know if you could say standard material, but sort of like, you know, other people's music. It was a bit of my own, and those were maybe somewhat spontaneous, and more based on the fact that I was in Copenhagen at the time. You know, Steeplechase, the Steeplechase aesthetic is very, how should I put it? It's very quick. You know, the process is very, it's like an improvisation. You know, there's not a lot of time spent on the recording process. It's sort of usually Niels Winter from Steeplechase will do but at least 2 recordings in one day, if not 3. You know, these were just a couple hours, you know, and I'm sort of used to working like that, but, you know, that sort of influences how your recordings come out. Like if it's, you know, it's almost more like a live record. So I wanted to do a solo record that maybe had a little bit more thoughtfulness in it, maybe some prepared material and then also some improvisational material. I picked a few pieces that were new. I picked a few things that I had wanted to record for a long time. It just so happens that Nation Divided is, you know, I thought that was a good theme because because of one of the pieces on the CD, and then there's some other things that have a little bit of political reflection, or I should say, it reflects some of the things that are going on in our nation. And I think it's not new for musicians and artists to think politically, even though I think that there is a certain, you know, some people will say, well, music will change everything. You know, music, all we need, you know, because I will lament about certain things going on in the world, and people will say, well, people need to hear your music, and music will heal. And I think that's possible if only it were that easy, you know. There's so much great music. It certainly helped to heal me, but if it was really that easy. So I don't know. In a way, this recording is maybe my question more than my answer. The question is, music matter, you know, and I think it matters for us to sort of, you know, live our lives. It helps us. But it doesn't necessarily solve anything. In terms of the United States, in terms of the history, you know, this isn't necessarily anything new. It's just in a different box. It's sort of been, the division in the nation, I think, has just been rebranded.
Yeah.
Well, that's the problem is a lot of people have short memories. So, like, when you look at, you know, the campaigns of Nixon, the campaigns of Reagan, the campaigns of, you know, what's interesting is that a lot of people feel like, well, we're not very happy with this president, you know. First of all, that's not a new idea, but that's what we're supposed to be able to freely express with something called freedom of speech. I mean, that's one of the things that makes our country great is the ability to speak out, you know, that we don't have a lockdown on that like we do, like there is in other countries, you know. But the idea of having a terrible president is not new either, you know. I mean, whether our current president is the worst, history will say, you know. We've had many terrible presidents. If you just want to look at the presidency, I mean, obviously Andrew Johnson, you know, Franklin Pierce. I mean, like, history talks about, I mean, it's entertaining to read and watch documentaries about some of our previous presidents, You know what I mean? Like, Warren Harding was a pretty terrible president. Although, then you look at people who say, well, we go back and see the good things that he did. I mean, and then you could also see the things that JFK did that were not possible, So, I don't know. I think that's what's interesting about history and sort of like, trying to assess, the present through the lens of the past. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Yeah, well, all politics is a big carousel, and it all depends on how long it takes to come back around, because ultimately it will reverberate, but it will sound different, And I think probably in this modern day and era of being so saturated with everything being so transparent, everybody has cameras, we got reality TV everywhere, we would like to think that we have people that are being honest and upfront with us, and I guess that to me seems like what the precipice that we're standing on and we're tired of, whether it's our president or it's Congress or it's any guy that comes into a grade school and decides to start forking over something that's disingenuous, that's condescending, and that doesn't hit us on a root level of being kind of just regular people. And I think we're tired of that. And I think that your leadership embodies that principle. And if you're going to have fighting and lying be a part of what you do, whether you're Republican or Democrat, it's time for that to go away because no one wants it.
I agree with you. But, unfortunately, and the other thing, too, is sort of the politics is blood sport. Politics, we talk about, like, this is such a bitter campaign and the rhetoric. You go back to Andrew Jackson's time and you go back to, earlier campaigns in the 19th century. And it wasn't the same because we didn't have this sort of national media, but it was very similar. I think that in a way that part of it's always been there. I think some of these things are not necessarily new. I think that maybe we could say that, I'll say for myself, and obviously I tend to lean a certain way, but I think I was kind of lulled into complacency by 8 years of a Democratic president, and not really feeling like I needed to think about some of these other ideas. I mean, that's a whole other discussion too, in terms of how effective Barack Obama could be with an oppositional Congress, And maybe we'll see a Democratic House of Representatives will be a balance. I hope so. The theme of my record, I think, is more about the question rather than the answer, because I don't think anybody has the answer. But I think it's sort of like times like these will make you really think about life and the future in a different way. And I would say that definitely the past 2 years I've thought about things differently. And anytime you experience something, because for me, witnessing somebody so reprehensible, in my opinion, become president was traumatic for me because of the way I believe. I was in New York when 9/11 happened. That was very traumatic as well. And so, it just makes you think about what you want to do with your life and what's important to you. And art, and we're lucky as artists that we can put that into our music or put that into whatever we're doing. And it's more about the emotional aspect of it, and not necessarily anything specific, because I'm I'm not running for any office, and I think I probably wouldn't be a great politician, and that's the other thing too, is you think about just like the whole idea of somebody saying, well, I'm going to represent. There's been times when I'm like, well, maybe I should pursue that. My father had experience in politics. And so I would say that was part of my upbringing. He worked for Jimmy Carter. My father worked for the Carter administration under Tip O'Neill. And so, I used to kind of hear about these ideas and it's interesting though, because I think Jimmy Carter's a great man, but most historians rank him pretty low as a president.
Yeah,
some of that I think.
Yeah, it's astonishing.
You know, but a lot of the ideals that he believes in, I believe in those as well. But I think from the technical aspect of doing the job, I don't think he was very good. And it's interesting too because I think you could make maybe tenuous, but you could make a comparison with Jimmy Carter and Donald Trump in that there's that outsider thing that appeals to a lot of people. And in terms of the timing of Jimmy Carter, obviously Nixon and Ford and the Vietnam War, people wanted to kind of go a completely other direction, you know. And I can really see that, you know, in some ways, you know, Carter being this completely unknown, but having the press really liked Carter. So he got a lot of attention, and in the same way that Trump, I mean, he's like a garbage fire, you know.
Yeah.
He's like a car wreck. You know, you can't look away. It's like it's stimulating even if you hate him. You know what I mean? So the press definitely is partially to blame for Donald. They gave him so much free press, so much free publicity, you know, so much attention, and I see a bit of a similarity there. You know, Carter just had a lot of bad luck and didn't, and it's interesting. I mean, I would say they're completely the opposite in the sense that Carter promised he would never lie to the American people, whereas Donald Trump constantly lies, and he basically has his core following that he'll just basically tell them what they want to hear. I mean, that's what's so sad. And yet, in some ways, America likes entertainment.
Yep, we do.
So, like, it really shouldn't be a surprise. But what I hope is that I would really like to somehow get that element out of politics. I mean, unfortunately, it's, you know, we have 2 more years at the very least. Look, I'll take last night. I mean, obviously it's not perfect, but I feel like it's a step in the right direction. At least it doesn't feel as hopeless, you know, as it has in the past, other times in the past 2 years, you know. You know, in terms of how I want to make a difference, if you will, you know, posting stuff on Facebook or, you know, whatever. I mean, it only has but so much effect. I actually had a fundraiser in Portland where I had a bunch of musicians, you know, the top Portland musicians. We had a fundraising concert where we raised money for something called Raíces, which is a organization that gives legal help to migrant families and children. And so we raised a whole bunch of money for them. And I felt like, well, that's, at least I did something. It's not just complaining, it's actually doing something, you know.
Yeah.
And making a statement, and you know, it's sort of saying like, hey, we are people that we are against this, you know, we want to help these people, you know. So I think we need to have more of that instead of people just like sort of posting like, oh, this is messed up, you know, and trying to think of the most clever memes they can or whatever, you know what I mean, like that sort of thing. Like people need to, in whatever small way, make a difference, you know. Not just say you're against these types of things, but show it if you can.
So let me ask you this. Did you grow up in New York?
No, I was born in New Jersey, and I was raised mostly in Maryland, in Columbia, Maryland, which is considered a suburb of Baltimore.
So you're a pianist, an organist, a drummer, a trumpeter, a band leader. You're a teacher as well. So talk to me about the beginnings of how you got into music and even the jazz music you listened to in the beginning.
My parents were not musicians, but they had a bit of a music collection and they were interested in music. My father was into the swing era bands like you know, Harry James and Benny Goodman. He had a Bunny Berrigan record. And they also had a Fats Waller record, which I always liked as a kid. They were into musicals. My mother had, you know, Judy Garland records, and, you know, they had, like, soundtracks of My Fair Lady, and, you know, my father had some some 78s of Toscanini. You know, so I don't know. I wouldn't say it's a musical household, but there was some interest in music. You know, my parents liked to sing because they were really into musicals. Sometimes they would sing to me, and we would learn little silly songs, you know. I took piano lessons in second grade, and I only lasted about a month. I didn't practice. I didn't get it, you know. And then my father told me that he thought I should play trumpet, because he always wanted to be a trumpet player. He really liked Harry James. And actually he had some Jonah Jones records, you know, which is another guy that people don't ever talk about. But like, you know, he had a bunch of Jonah Jones records, and, you know, and so he wanted me to play trumpet. And so when they came around asking if people wanted to be in the band in fourth grade, I said I would play trumpet, and I still didn't really get it in terms of practicing and that. And I tried to quit, but I was kind of too shy to tell the band director I didn't want to do it, so I played another year. Then when I got into sixth grade, it was middle school, different band director, and his name was Lee Stevens, and he was super inspiring, and I started to really get into practicing, and also Mr. Stevens turned me on to a lot of listening, you know, because I took a music appreciation class, and he, you know, kind of exposed me to Clifford Brown and Herbie Hancock and the Headhunters and Weather Report and Coltrane, and then there was a neighbor on my block that gave me a bunch of records. They're mostly trumpet players. Gave me a Clifford Brown record, gave me a Miles Davis record. I think he was lending them to me, but I don't think he ever got them back. You know, there was a Art Farmer Donald Byrd record, Dizzy Gillespie record. I think there was a Coltrane record in there. But, you know, so I started really getting into listening, and I started listening to more classical music. I was really into Beethoven and Stravinsky, and it was, you know, this is before the distraction of the internet. So, like, when you listen to a record, you really sat down and listened to it. And so that was one thing I really loved to do. I was trying to figure out how to make the connection. Like, I didn't have very good ears at the time, so it wasn't like I could just play stuff by ear. Like, I mean, I would listen and listen and listen, but trying to, like, understand the harmony and, you know, how to learn stuff off of records was not very easy for me. So we always had a piano. So sometimes I would try to sit down and figure out stuff, but it was really slow. And then I took a piano class in high school, just like a general piano class, and that started to kind of get the ball rolling in terms of understanding harmony. And I sort of thought, well, maybe I want to be a composer, so I started, you know, writing simple pieces, and I ended up getting my degree in classical trumpet and music ed from Peabody Conservatory in Baltimore. But I knew that I wanted to do jazz in some way, so it was sort of at Peabody where, even though I was a trumpet major, I spent a lot of time practicing jazz piano. And I ended up getting a lot of gigs around Baltimore playing piano. So when I graduated, it just seemed like the natural switch to become a pianist. You know, that was in like 1991. And so, I mean, I play other instruments, but I mean, I think I'm most known as a pianist, and you know, I think that was more what I was meant to do, you know, is be a pianist. So, you know, I've been, you know, essentially making a living as a pianist for about 30 years, you know.
How did everything start for you in your career, more specifically in New York? I mean, you've been on 100+ CDs, you've had plenty on your own, you've played with so many people in your career. How did everything kind of start and ramp up for you?
You know, I could say that it kind of started in Baltimore and Washington, because I was playing with a lot of people down there, and sometimes people would come to town and I would play with them, you know, like sort of more name type of people, and I'd be a sideman with them. And then I sort of made this association with Gary Bartz, the altoist, and Gary Thomas, the tenor saxophonist, both of whom are from Baltimore. And I was playing with Gary Bartz and more gigs around D.C. and Baltimore, but Gary Thomas had a tour of Europe, he asked me to do it, but he wanted me to play organ, and I had never played organ. So he was looking for somebody to play, because he had this organ concept. He did this record called Exile's Gate, and he had different people playing organ, but I think he wanted somebody to play organ sort of not like a traditional organist, you know. He wanted something maybe a little bit more forward-thinking, and I think his idea was to have somebody that wasn't really an organist, just to come in with a fresh perspective, which I was happy to make the attempt to oblige that notion. You know, I didn't really know, like, you know, I mean, the organ is a keyboard, but, you know, there's important differences, like you have to figure out how to turn it on and how to get the Leslie speaker working and all the drawbars and everything. So I had to kind of take a few little lessons, and another thing I used to do is I would, you know, they had a B3 at a store in Wheaton, Maryland at the Chuck Levin's Music, and I used to go in and pretend like I was, you know, looking to buy, and I would just sit there and practice for as many hours as I could before people in the store started to look at me funny. So that was kind of how I got the basic organ knowledge together to go on this tour. So it just seemed like the inertia was going towards, like, you know, I need to get out of Maryland and get to New York, because that's where the opportunities are. And so I moved to New York in 1995. And I think because I was already playing with Gary Bartz, and I was playing at some of the clubs with him, you know, Bradley's and Sweet Basil and that kind of thing, that helped me to get some visibility more quickly than if I had just come without that connection. So in a way, the sideman stuff, looking back on it, it was a bit of a snowball, because, you know, I went from playing with Gary Bartz to all of a sudden Vanessa Rubin, the vocalist, she saw me with Gary, and then she was like, well, I want to hire you, so I started working with her. And then, you know, just having that visibility, you know, people started calling me, you know, and I didn't necessarily have to schmooze or anything. Like, some people really feel like you have to kind of make the scene and, you know, do a lot of networking and stuff. And I think you have to do it in a way that's really organic. Like, you know, I think if you sort of do it in a way that's a little bit too calculated, it can be a bit of a turnoff, you know. And I can say from my own experience, some of the gigs that I pursued sort of later, like, you know, I sort of pursued playing with Joshua Redman and John Schofield and Dave Douglas, and, you know, I think it was a little bit too conscious, and so I think they were a bit turned off by that, you know. Or maybe they didn't like how I played. That's possible. You know what I mean? But it's interesting, because I remember having a conversation with Don Byron about it. I told him that I had pursued some things. I had sent them my material, and he was like, oh, well, if you do that, you'll never work with them. You know, it's almost like this idea that if you pursue something too hard, it has the opposite effect. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I would say in terms of sideman stuff, like, I think that it was just being in the right place at the right time and sort of having a reputation develop, where it was like, oh, here's somebody who's playing with this guy. I mean, and I think that's how it works for a lot of people, you know. It's just like your name gets passed around once you're kind of on this particular list. And I consider it luck as well as skill. I mean, I did spend a lot of hours practicing, and any group that I played in, I was, you know, very diligent in terms of how I prepared the music, and, you know, I tried to bring, you know, that energy to whomever I played with. And I still do that now. But, I mean, I would say that, I mean, and this is the kind of advice I give to my students. It's not a very cut and dry process, but if you make the scene and you can play well, people will know about you. You know, if you force it, you run the risk of alienating people, you know. Although I think maybe that works for some people in certain situations, you know. Yeah. Sort of, you know, Like if you were to call up somebody and be like, man, I really want to play with you. I never did that. You know, I just, a lot of the gigs that I got, I didn't even know that they were thinking about me, you know. I could go down the list. I mean, you know, Buster Williams, Don Byron, Cassandra Wilson, Robbie Coltrane, like that all just happened organically. They called me, and I subbed in some other groups, you know, with Nicholas Payton and Christian McBride and you know, Stephon Harris and stuff. But it wasn't. I never like went out of my way to say like, hey, I'm interested in playing with you, which is really strange because, you know, most other fields don't work that way. You know, you're supposed to fill out an application or you're supposed to send a resume, you know what I mean? And then do an interview process and act like you want to, you know, I would love to be a part of this company. You know, that's that sort of thing. You know, in jazz, you don't do that.
So let me ask you this. Why do you love jazz?
I think I've always had just a natural affinity for it. Like, whereas, I mean, I would say it's strange because jazz is not America's popular music anymore. It was, you know, maybe for a brief time in the 30s and 40s. It doesn't have a public presence the way it used to. So it's a bit odd for anybody really in this day and age to get into jazz. It's such a small share of the market, and it just doesn't have. You don't hear it in ads all the time. It's not on TV. It's this, you know, very underground music. You have to really kind of either have it pushed in your face or be looking for it. And it's really strange compared to, like, I mean, the more pop music progresses away from that, the more strange it is for someone who is growing up listening to Kanye West or, you know, or Drake or whatever they're listening to, you know, to hear jazz. They just don't have any reference point. I mean, at least at first. But I don't know. I always was attracted to it. And I would even go as far as to say the less I understood it, the more I was interested in it, you know. So things like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, hearing that, or Wynton Marsalis and Branford Marsalis, like, that was always, I always was like, wow, I want to know more about that. I want to hear this. It was exciting for me. I always liked the rhythmic aspect of it and sort of the complexity of it. That's always kind of had an appeal to me. I very distinctly remember in middle school, there was a group that came and performed, and they were kind of half jazz, half gospel. It was an instrumental quartet, but they played some kind of gospel-y things. And I remember being really moved by that performance, like hearing people jazz live was really, I remember just being taken to a magical place, you know, even as a middle schooler. I remember after the concert, I went back to math class, and I said to the guy next to me, I was like, wow, that concert was really amazing. And he turned to me and he said, you liked that crap? So, you know, that's when you're sort of like, well, do I buckle to the peer pressure and say, well, if he doesn't like it, maybe I shouldn't like it? Or do you stick to your guns and say, well, I liked it, so you're wrong? And that's what I've always done. I've always said, well, I like it, so I'm going to listen to it. And so I think I've just always had a natural affinity to it. And I mean, I would say just upon further analysis now, I mean, there's definitely aspects of being a jazz musician as compared to other types of music that I appreciate. I mean, the improvisational aspect, obviously, the chance to do something unique that is unique to your experience. I really appreciate that, and I think that's been the most fulfilling thing about it, is that I can essentially create my own music within this genre, and I can be a composer, I can be a performer, I can be an improviser, and it's kind of all connected, and it's sort of like, it's a very similar process to how you evolve as a human being. There's room for growth, you know, and there's room for growth every night. If you play in a rock band or a pop band or a cover band, you know, it's like once you learn, or you know, as a classical musician, you know, there is a limitation. There's great things about all genres, but, you know, the fact that you, as a performer in other genres, are limited to a certain set of notes, regardless of how much you like that music or how great you can execute it or how successful you are financially, what have you. It's like there is that limitation, for better or for worse. For just how I see things, I'm grateful for that opportunity. The fact that you can take a risk. You can play something that you have no idea whether it's going to work, you know, and you could do that on the bandstand and get paid to experiment, essentially. If only we could live our lives like that. I mean, that's where the true idea of freedom, I mean, we talk about freedom in terms of life, like how much freedom do we really have? I mean, you know, once you have, you know, a family, it's like the older you get, it's sort of like, well, you take fewer risks because you understand the consequences a little bit more. But you're like, if I do this could potentially ruin my whole life. So I'm not going to do that. But in music, you can take the kind of risks that you can't take in life. You know what I mean? Like, in that context, that's what's important to me. That's why I value the path that I've somewhat chosen and also somewhat sort of lucked into.
So this is my final question for you. Everyone has an interpretation or a perception of who you are, your family, your friends, your fans, but you know who you are. So who do you think you are?
That sounds like a real Brooklyn question. Who do you think you are? You talking to me?
This is Goodfellas with the jazz stand.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I make you laugh.
I got big red nose, big feet.
That's funny. You know, I think we're all, you know, the human condition is something to really consider. And I think, who am I? I mean, you know, I'm very dedicated to music. Obviously, I have a family, and I really love my kids. You know, they're amazing. We're sort of given a purpose from a higher authority. I think my purpose was to be a musician. It's not always the easiest lifestyle, you know, but I think at some point, and, you know, the older you get, the more you tend to look back, but I sort of, you know, I'm getting to the point where I'm probably going to be looking back more than I'm looking forward. Although I still want to look forward. That's the thing, is I feel like as a person, we should never stop growing. We should never stop learning. Our time on earth is valuable. Maybe some people get to a point where they're like, this is who I am. This is what I do. I'm not going to change anything. I'm not going to explore anything. I don't judge people for doing that. I think that there is maybe a sensibility to that is fine. But for me, there's just so much to explore, and so I don't necessarily want to be complacent, you know. It is a natural tendency as you get older to sort of think in a different way, you know, certainly like from a physical standpoint, you know, we're even the healthiest 50-year-old, you know, has to start to consider some things, you know. The healthiest 60-year-old is you know, going to have different limitations and a different outlook. There's still so much that I want to do musically. I'm still embracing everything as a process. You know what I mean? And seeing that there's always something to learn. Even though I'm entering sort of the next chapter in a way, like I don't feel like that's necessarily a negative thing. I think I can still, you know, learn things. I can still improve as a player. And there's things I want to do career-wise. It's essentially, as a musician, and I think as a person, you just keep doing it until you can't do it anymore. That's how I think about music. That's how I think about life. And I guess that's who I am.
I like it, man. That's a great answer.
Yeah.
George, thank you. I appreciate you opening up about your music, about your life in music and jazz. It's been a pleasure, man. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, anytime.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players and cats in Portland, New York City, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to George for his class, his cool, and his time. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com. And for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.